They told me silence only exists in empty rooms, but I learned it can exist in a room full of people who are too afraid to breathe. It started the night I worked a gala in downtown Manhattan, where every glass of champagne looked like it cost more than my entire weekly paycheck. I was just a waitress, moving through the crowd with practiced steps, balancing trays, and avoiding eye contact the way you do when you don't belong anywhere, but still have to act like you do. That was the night Ethan Blackwell walked in. No announcement, no introduction, just a shift in the air, like the building itself had decided to stand straighter. Conversations didn't stop because someone asked them to. They stopped because they suddenly felt unimportant. I remember pausing for half a second near the edge of the ballroom, tray in hand, noticing how even the chandeliers seemed less bright when he entered. Ethan Blackwell didn't look loud. He didn't need to. He wore control the way most people wore clothing, effortless and final. Dark suit, steady pace, eyes that didn't wander unless something mattered. And for reasons I didn't understand then, his eyes landed on me for a fraction of a second longer than they should have. I told myself it meant nothing. People like him didn't notice people like me. But something about that moment stayed with me, like a word you almost remember but can't quite say out loud. The event continued, laughter returning in waves, glasses clinking again, but the rhythm had changed. Even I could feel it. As I moved between tables, I kept hearing fragments of his name whispered by guests who spoke like they were careful not to say it too clearly. Ethan Blackwell. Not loud, not exaggerated, just acknowledged. I should have ignored it, but curiosity has a way of surviving exhaustion. Later, when I passed near the central hall, I saw him standing just beyond the center of the room, not surrounded, not performing, just observing. And for the first time that night, I realized something unsettling. It wasn't that people were looking at him. It was that they were waiting for him to look at them. I lowered my gaze and kept walking, reminding myself I was there to work, not to wonder. But then I heard it, a voice calm enough to cut through the noise without raising itself. You. One word. Not shouted. Not forced. Just directed. I didn't look up at first. I assumed it wasn't meant for me. People like him didn't speak to people like me. But then the room shifted again, and I realized every sound had thinned out around that single direction. Slowly, I raised my eyes. And that was the moment everything before it started to feel like it had been leading somewhere I didn't understand yet. I remember that moment clearly, the way my body reacted before my mind could even decide what to do. The word was simple, just one syllable, but it carried a weight that made everything else in the room feel distant, like sound had been pulled underwater. I stood there holding the tray, my hands steady only because I had trained them to be steady, and I realized every eye in the ballroom was no longer on their conversations or their drinks, but slowly drifting toward the same point. Toward him. And now toward me. I should have walked away. That would have been the rational choice. Instead, I moved forward one careful step at a time, the polished floor reflecting lights that suddenly felt too bright. Ethan Blackwell did not change his posture as I approached. He simply watched me with a kind of attention that felt unfamiliar, not intrusive, not warm, but precise, as if he was noticing details most people would never think to see. When I stopped a few feet away from him, I lowered my tray slightly, unsure whether I was supposed to speak or wait. The silence between us was not empty. It was full, like something had already been said without words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice calm, measured, almost too controlled for the environment around him. He asked me a question that seemed too simple for the weight it carried. What is your name? I hesitated only a second before answering, because there was no reason not to. Emily Carter. I expected him to nod, to turn away, to return to whatever world people like him usually occupied. Instead, he repeated my name once, slowly, like he was testing how it sounded in a place it had never been spoken before. Around us, I could feel the shift in the room intensifying. Conversations continued, but they no longer held confidence. They felt rehearsed, distracted, aware. Someone behind me dropped their voice to a whisper, but I could not make out the words. Ethan's gaze did not leave mine. Then he asked another question, quieter this time, almost casual in tone, yet it felt like it carried more meaning than anything else in the room. Do you always answer people honestly? The question confused me for a moment. It was not what I expected from someone like him, not something about business or status or anything that matched the way others spoke about him in fragments. I answered carefully. I tried to. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. A subtle change, like he had been waiting for that exact phrasing. He took a small step closer, not enough to threaten space, but enough to make the distance between us feel intentional now. Most people say they always do, he said. You did not. I did not know how to respond to that, so I did not. Instead, I held his gaze, and for the first time since the evening began, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not fear, not confidence, something in between that I could not yet name. Around us, the room continued pretending nothing unusual was happening, but I could feel it clearly now. Nothing about this moment was ordinary, and nothing about him had been either from the start. I did not answer immediately, because something about the way he looked at me made silence feel like the safest response I had ever known. It was not intimidation in the way people usually imagine it, not loud or aggressive, but controlled, like every thought he had was measured before it ever reached his expression. Around us, the ballroom continued its quiet illusion of normalcy, but I could feel how carefully people were watching from a distance, pretending they were not. Ethan Blackwell remained still, his attention locked on me as if the rest of the room had already been dismissed from relevance. Then he spoke again, his voice steady and low, as if he had no interest in performing for anyone else. You do not hesitate when you speak, he said. I blinked once, unsure if that was meant as observation or judgment. I did hesitate, I replied carefully. Just not for very long. Something almost unnoticeable crossed his expression, not a smile, not approval, but recognition. As if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. He tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that made me hyper-aware of every detail I had never thought mattered before. The way I stood, the way I held the tray, the way I kept my shoulders steady even when everything around me felt heavier than usual. Most people overcompensate when they are nervous, he said. They speak too quickly or too much. You do neither. I did not know what to say to that, so I simply answered the truth. I have learned that silence is safer. The words left my mouth before I could reconsider them. For a fraction of a second, I thought I had said too much. But instead of withdrawing, Ethan Blackwell seemed to register them with more interest. The atmosphere around us had changed again. It was subtle, but undeniable. Conversations in the distance slowed. People were no longer just watching, they were listening. I became aware of how unusual that was, how someone like me, a waitress in a crowded gala, could suddenly feel like the center of something I did not understand. Ethan finally glanced away from me, just briefly, scanning the room as if checking whether anyone had interrupted this moment. Then he returned his gaze to me and asked another question, quieter than before, but sharper in meaning. Who taught you that silence is safer? I hesitated this time. Not because I did not know the answer, but because I did. And something about saying it aloud felt like opening a door I had kept closed for a long time. Life, I said simply. He studied me for a long moment after that, longer than comfort allowed, and yet I did not look away. I could feel something shifting, not in him alone, but in the space between us, like the beginning of a pattern neither of us had agreed to but both of us had already entered. And for reasons I could not explain, I stayed exactly where I was. I could feel the weight of his attention without him needing to say anything more. It was strange how silence between two people could start to feel structured, almost like it had rules I did not yet understand. Ethan Blackwell stood in front of me with the same calm presence, but something had changed in the way the room responded to him. It was no longer just respect or fear at a distance. It was anticipation, like everyone was waiting for a moment they did not know had already begun. I adjusted my grip on the tray slightly, realizing my hands were no longer shaking, just unusually aware. Ethan finally broke the silence again, his voice steady but lower than before, as if he had decided the rest of the room no longer deserved to hear him. You said life taught you that silence is safer, he said. I nodded once, not trusting myself to expand on it. He studied me for a moment longer, then took a slow step to the side, not closing distance, but changing perspective, as if he was trying to see me from a different angle. That is an interesting lesson, he said. Most people learn the opposite. I replied without thinking too long. Most people do not have a choice in what they learn. That answer seemed to land differently. I noticed it immediately in his expression, not surprise, but a quiet recalibration, like a detail in a larger equation had just shifted. Around us, The gala continued its illusion of elegance, but I could sense the invisible lines forming between people, the way conversations bent away from this moment without anyone admitting it. Ethan gestured slightly toward the edge of the ballroom, not commanding, but inviting movement without words. I hesitated only briefly before following a few steps beside him, still holding the tray, still technically working, yet aware that nothing about this felt like work anymore. When we stopped near a quieter section of the hall, he turned slightly toward me again. The lighting here was softer, less reflective, and it made his presence feel even more contained, as if the environment itself had adjusted around him. "Emily Carter," he said again, like he was confirming it still fit. I answered carefully, "Yes." There was a pause that felt longer than it should have been. Then he asked, "If silence is safer, why are you speaking to me now?" The question was simple, but it carried weight I could not immediately place. I thought about it honestly before answering. "Because silence is not always a choice," I said. "Sometimes it is just what is left when everything else has been taken away." I did not expect him to react so visibly to that, but I saw something shift again in his gaze, something quieter, more focused, like the conversation had moved into territory he recognized but rarely entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world around us continued its movement. Glasses lifted, laughter attempted, music playing softly in the background, but none of it reached this space between us. Ethan finally spoke again, his tone unchanged but more deliberate. "And what would you say if you were not in a room like this?" I looked at him, fully aware now that this was no longer about small talk or curiosity. It was something else entirely, something I could not yet define, but I answered anyway. "I would say the truth does not need permission to exist." The moment I said it, I felt the air change again, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed how still he became. Not distant, not distracted, just still, like my words had landed somewhere they were not expected to reach. And for the first time since the evening began, I realized I was not the one trying to understand the room anymore. I was trying to understand him. I did not realize how easily conversation could become something that felt like crossing an invisible line until I noticed that neither of us was pretending anymore. The space around Ethan Blackwell and me no longer felt like part of the gala, even though music continued and glasses still clinked somewhere behind us. It felt separated, like the rest of the room had been turned down in volume without anyone announcing it. He looked at me for a long moment after I spoke, and instead of responding immediately, he simply observed me with a kind of stillness that made time feel slightly delayed. Then he finally spoke, his voice even lower than before, not because he was hiding it, but because he no longer needed to project it. "Truth without permission," he repeated slowly, as if testing the structure of the idea itself. I nodded once, unsure why my heartbeat felt more noticeable than before. He did not look away when he continued speaking. "Most people believe truth is something you negotiate," he said. "Something you adjust depending on who is listening." I answered carefully, choosing my words with more awareness now. "Then most people are not honest, they are just careful." Something subtle shifted in his expression again, not approval, not disagreement, but recognition that I was not speaking casually. For the first time since the beginning of this interaction, I noticed that he was no longer just asking questions. He was evaluating the answers in a way that felt deeper than conversation. Ethan took a slow step closer, not invading space, but closing a boundary that had previously existed. I did not move back. I was not sure why. "Emily Carter," he said again, but this time it sounded less like confirmation and more like intention. I felt the way my name sounded in his voice more clearly than I wanted to admit. "Yes," I responded, keeping my tone steady. He paused briefly, then turned his gaze slightly toward the edge of the ballroom, where people continued their evening without interruption. "Do you know why I asked you to speak?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, because I had assumed it was accidental, or curiosity, or simply a moment that meant nothing beyond itself. I hesitated before answering honestly. "No," he nodded once, as if that answer aligned with something he already understood. "Because most people in this room would have told me what they thought I wanted to hear," he said. "You did not." I felt something tighten in my chest at that observation, not discomfort, but awareness. I realized I was being placed into a category I did not recognize, not judged, not praised, simply noted. Ethan finally shifted his attention fully toward me again. "Tell me something else," he said, Not what is expected. What is real? The request was simple, but it carried weight that made the air between us feel more focused. I looked at him for a moment, then answered without preparing a polished version of myself. Real is usually not comfortable, I said. That is why people avoid it. For the first time, I saw something like a pause in him, not hesitation, but consideration that lasted longer than a second. Around us, the gala seemed distant now, as if I had stepped slightly outside of it without moving. Ethan's voice came again, measured and steady. Then you are either very brave or very honest, he said. I shook my head slightly. Neither. I am just used to consequences. That line changed something I could not immediately define. His expression softened in a way that did not make him appear less powerful, only more aware. He did not respond right away. Instead, he looked past me briefly, toward the room, then back again, as if making a decision that did not require permission from anyone else. Stay here, he said calmly. It was not an order spoken loudly, but it carried certainty. And strangely, I found myself not moving at all. I stayed exactly where I was, not because I was told to, but because something in the way he said it made movement feel unnecessary. Ethan Blackwell had already turned slightly away from me, as if my presence in that moment was no longer something he needed to confirm repeatedly. Instead, he scanned the room with that same controlled stillness, and I realized he was not ignoring the gala. He was reading it, like every person in the space was part of a pattern only he could see. A few seconds passed before he spoke again, without looking directly at me. People here are very good at pretending nothing is happening, he said calmly. I followed his gaze without fully understanding why I was still standing beside him instead of returning to my work. Is something supposed to be happening? I asked. My question was honest, not defensive, just uncertain. That earned the smallest shift in his expression, something subtle that almost resembled acknowledgement. That depends on what you consider important, he replied. His tone did not change, but something about the weight behind his words made the air feel slightly more concentrated. I became aware again of how different he was from everyone else in the room. It was not just his presence or the way others reacted to him. It was the absence of hesitation in everything he did. Even silence around him felt intentional. I adjusted my stance slightly, still holding the tray, though it felt less relevant now. I am just working an event, I said, almost as a reminder to myself. He finally turned his attention fully back toward me at that, as if that sentence had placed me back into focus. No, he said quietly. You are not just working an event. I did not respond immediately. There was something about the certainty in his voice that made contradiction feel unnecessary, not because I agreed, but because he was speaking as if he had already observed enough to conclude otherwise. He took a small step to the side, then gestured slightly toward a quieter section of the ballroom again, not forcing movement, but suggesting it with certainty that made resistance feel irrelevant. I followed after a brief pause, my steps measured, still aware of the eyes that occasionally flickered in our direction, but never lingered long enough to acknowledge what they saw. When we stopped again, the distance from the center of the room felt greater than it actually was. The sound of the gala dulled slightly, like we had crossed into a different layer of the same space. Ethan spoke without turning fully toward me. Tell me something you do not say out loud, he said. The question landed differently than the others. It was not about observation anymore. It was about boundaries. I looked at him for a moment, weighing the simplicity of it against the instinct to keep certain parts of myself untouched by conversation. Finally, I answered. Most people assume I do not notice things, I said, but I notice everything. He glanced at me then, not surprised, but attentive in a way that felt more serious than before. And you still choose silence, he said. I nodded slightly, because noticing does not always mean speaking. That response seemed to settle something in him, though he did not explain what. Instead, he looked away briefly, toward the center of the ballroom, then back again. When he spoke, his voice was steady but lower than before. That is why you stood out, he said. I did not know how to respond to that, so I did not. For the first time since the beginning of the evening, the silence between us did not feel like absence. It felt like something that had direction. I noticed the change in his attention before I noticed anything else. Ethan Blackwell was no longer just observing the room or speaking in fragments that felt like tests. Something in him had shifted into a quieter stillness, the kind that did not belong to curiosity anymore, but to decision. He looked past me briefly, toward the far side of the ballroom, and for the first time I felt the presence of the room return slightly, like I had been pulled back into reality after standing too long outside of it. But he did not move away. Instead, he spoke in a tone that was calm, but carried more direction than before. "Tell me something," he said, pausing just long enough that I knew the next words mattered. "If you were not standing here right now, what would you be doing?" The question surprised me more than it should have, not because it was personal, but because it assumed there was a version of me outside this moment that he was genuinely interested in understanding. I thought about it honestly before answering. "I would probably be finishing my shift and going home," I said. "Nothing complicated." He nodded slightly, but it did not feel like agreement. It felt like evaluation. "And does that feel like enough for you?" he asked. I hesitated, not because I did not know the answer, but because I had never been asked to define it so directly. Around us, the gala continued its polished performance, but it felt further away now, like a reflection behind glass. "It is what I have," I said finally. "Not necessarily what I want." That answer seemed to land differently. He did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze held steady on me for a moment longer than before, as if confirming something he had been forming silently since the beginning of our conversation. Then he spoke again, quieter now. "Most people confuse what they have with what they accept," he said. I looked at him carefully. "Are you saying I should want something different?" He exhaled slowly, not in dismissal, but in thought. "I am saying you already do," he replied. The simplicity of that statement made my thoughts pause. I had no immediate response, because it felt like he had spoken to something I had not yet put into words myself. For the first time that evening, the space between us no longer felt like a question and answer exchange. It felt like a line was forming, something neither of us had named, but both of us had begun to notice. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, then looked toward the center of the ballroom again, where conversations continued as if nothing had changed. When he spoke next, his tone was measured but carried a different weight. "People in rooms like this believe control is something they display," he said. "But real control is what happens when no one is watching." I followed his gaze without fully understanding why those words felt directed at me even though they were not. "And what does that have to do with me?" I asked. He turned his attention back to me immediately. "That depends on whether you realize you have been noticed," he said. The way he said it did not feel like a warning or a compliment. It felt like an observation that had already been finalized. I stood still for a moment, aware that nothing about this interaction was random anymore, even if I could not yet understand its shape. And for reasons I did not fully recognize, I did not step away. I became aware of the change before I understood it, the way a room changes temperature before a storm arrives. Ethan Blackwell was no longer simply speaking to me, and I was no longer simply answering questions. Something had settled into the space between us that felt more structured, more deliberate, like a conversation that had stopped being accidental a long time ago. He stood still for a moment, his attention briefly shifting toward the wider ballroom again, and I followed his gaze without meaning to. Everything still looked the same, the chandeliers, the glass, the movement of guests pretending not to observe anything unusual, but it felt different now, like I had stepped slightly outside the rhythm. Everyone else was still following. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm precision, but there was something more defined underneath it. "Do you ever feel like you are living in a place that does not fully see you?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was invasive, but because it was accurate in a way I had never heard spoken aloud. I hesitated before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I was careful. "Most people are not looking to see," I said. "They are looking to move on." He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something rather than surprised him. "And you accept that," he said. I considered the phrasing before responding. I adapted to it. There was a brief silence between us again, but it was no longer empty. It felt structured, like each pause had weight and intention behind it. Ethan's expression remained steady, but I noticed something subtle change in the way he observed me, not sharper, not softer, but more complete, as if he had begun assembling a clearer picture from everything I had said. "Adaptation is not the same as acceptance," he said finally. I looked at him directly. "Is that supposed to be a correction?" He did not react immediately. Instead, he allowed a brief moment of silence before responding, and when he did, his tone remained even. "It is an observation," he said. People who adapt well usually had no choice in learning how. The words landed quietly, but they did not feel light. I did not respond right away, because there was no simple answer to that. Around us, the gala continued its normal rhythm, but I was now fully aware that nothing about this interaction belonged to that rhythm anymore. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, as if concluding one line of thought and entering another. "Tell me something," he said again, his voice steady. "If you were given a choice that removed all limitations you currently accept, would you take it?" The question felt different from the others. Not observational, not reflective, but directional. I studied him for a moment before answering. "It depends on what the choice costs," I said. He held my gaze without breaking it. "Everything has a cost," he replied. That answer should have ended the exchange, but it did not. Instead, it created a pause that felt heavier than the conversation itself. I realized then that I was no longer simply speaking to a stranger in a ballroom. I was participating in something that felt like it was still forming, something I could sense but not yet define. And for the first time that evening, I understood that stepping away would have required more certainty than staying. I did not realize the moment had shifted until Ethan Blackwell stopped speaking entirely. It was not abrupt, not dramatic, just a natural end to something that had been building without clear boundaries. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete, as if everything that needed to be said had already been placed between us in careful layers. I stood there, still holding the tray, aware that I had not moved back toward the flow of the gala, and neither had he. For a brief moment, he looked past me again, not at the room, but through it, like he was confirming something that existed beyond what anyone else could see. Then he returned his attention to me fully, and when he spoke this time, his voice carried a different weight, not curiosity, not evaluation, but finality. "You are not like the others here," he said. The statement was simple, but it did not feel like an observation anymore. It felt like a conclusion. I did not respond immediately because I understood that agreeing or denying would not change what he believed he had already seen. "I am just doing my job," I said finally, though even as I said it, I knew it sounded less convincing than before. He did not reject it, but he did not accept it either. Instead, he took a slow breath and looked toward the ballroom once more, as if checking the distance between this moment and everything else happening around us. "Most people use that sentence to stay invisible," he said. "You use it to stay grounded." I felt something subtle shift in my thoughts at that distinction, not discomfort, but awareness. It was as if he had named something I had never thought to define. The noise of the gala returned slightly to my senses again, laughter, and music filtering back into awareness, but it no longer felt like the center of anything. Ethan turned back to me and paused for a long moment before speaking again. "If I asked you to leave this room with me right now, what would you say?" The question was direct, but it was not delivered with pressure. It was delivered with certainty, as if the possibility already existed in his mind as a logical extension of everything that had come before. I did not answer immediately. I looked at him, then briefly at the room, then back again. I was not considering fear or danger or even consequence in the way I normally would. I was considering something simpler, the reality of choice itself. "I would ask why," I said finally. He nodded once, as if that answer was exactly what he expected. "Because staying here changes nothing for you," he said calmly. I held his gaze. "And leaving would?" I asked. For the first time that evening, he did not answer immediately. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer conversational. It felt like space being created rather than filled. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, steady, and absolute. "Yes," he said, and in that single word, everything that had been subtle, indirect, and uncertain finally became something I could no longer pretend was only a conversation.